Well, hey everybody, David Griffin here with Tyler Heidelberg, hanging out here and getting ready to talk with you about Romans week 6, but we're talking about Romans chapter 4.
Which is kind of confusing. But
Yeah, it could be a little bit confusing, but certainly been a good series so far. I guess we finished, we're past the halfway mark. Anything particular stood out to you in the Romans series or any particular message? Of course, the one you preached was the most meaningful.
Yes, the one I preached was the most meaningful. I think for me, just the most meaningful thing through this series has just been us working through the text and seeing Paul's whole transformation and him writing this. I think originally the reader would be like, this is insane that he's the guy who's writing this, because he lived by the law. Judaism, circumcised on the 8th day, that was like a part of who he was. And now he's saying it's not by the law at all that you come to faith or that has any relevance.
Right.
It's faith through Jesus alone.
Yeah.
And that's crazy to me that.
And if you read, I like to say, it's Jesus plus nothing equals salvation.
Exactly.
And we like to put Jesus plus, whatever, whether it be baptism or tongues or church attendance or tithing or whatever it is that we kind of, build into it on our own. When I sat down early on in this series, I guess before we even started it, I read the book of Romans. I read the whole thing in one sitting. And one of the things that I kind of took away from it as I spent some time looking at it, was that the Apostle Paul is talking to an audience of Jews primarily that have converted to Christianity, and now there are these pagan Gentiles that are coming into the fellowship. And so, of course, at first they want people to live up to the law. They want them to live up to the, the eating regulations and the Sabbath regulations. But then if they're willing to let go of those, Paul knows that the one thing that they're the most proud of is their heritage, and therefore their circumcision. And so we find that, that's a strange thing to be proud of, but they were very proud of that. And primarily because it meant that they were, related to Abraham, who God sovereignly and divinely called. And so this particular passage that we find is where Jesus, not Jesus, I'm in the wrong book.
That's okay.
That the Apostle Paul, it's okay, I take it, yes, forgiveness, even for trespass. That the Apostle Paul is kind of saying, look, if we go by your standards, if we go by the way that you're saying that a person gets saved, this kind of Jesus plus such and such, then even your forefather, Abraham, was not even saved. And that's really was a hard pill for them to swallow, don't you think?
Yeah. I think that's the crux of this passage right here, is talking about how Abraham was being justified by faith. And for me, I think that's why for us as believers, context is so important, because context removes confusion for us. And he knew that this would be something they struggled with. And he's saying, hey, if the law is what it's going to take, if it's Jesus plus something to get into the faith, well, then even your forefather Abraham wouldn't be qualified to be a part of this.
Yeah, because he was actually granted salvation as God initiated it. He responds, and this is actually years before he received circumcision as kind of the seal of that commitment. And so it wasn't circumcision that saved him. Obviously, it wasn't the law that saved him, because the law was actually written 600 years later, approximately 600 years later after Abraham. So if Abraham was saved, and certainly they all believe that, then their way of Jesus plus whatever was not going to work.
Yeah.
So what are some of the things that you find, or that you think of Jesus plus blank? What are some things that maybe you've struggled with, or you've seen other people struggle with, kind of adding to their salvation, or believing that it's part of their salvation?
Yeah, I think for me growing up, it was works. It was, I have to do something to be in right standing with God. And I had heard the gospel and I had heard the truth, but there was something within me that just believed it can't be Jesus plus nothing. I have to do something to be good enough. And the great thing about Christianity is that we come to find out, Jesus doesn't judge us based off our performance. Jesus judges us based off his perfection. And that perfection, it wins every time. And so we can be saved.
And people are so scared, and justifiably so, people are so scared that if we preach a true grace, that people are going to abuse it. and they're so scared that if we explain that you receive Jesus and you receive everything, and even though your life should change, if it doesn't, but you've received Jesus, you still go to heaven, that people are just going to be, live in all kinds of licentiousness. Right. Have you heard that argument several times before by people?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the things people would say. You talk about abused grace, and
Right.
I think that's one of the biggest things we're afraid of, and sometimes teaching the scandalous grace of the gospel.
Right.
But that's exactly what it is, and we see here, it's God's covenant, it's God's promise to Abraham, and even when Abraham, or even when I, or even when you are unfaithful to God, He will always be faithful to us.
Which is crazy, because when you read the story of Abraham, as we talked a little bit about on Sunday, is that when you read the story of Abraham, you're kind of blown away by his immorality.
Right.
I mean, you look at the way that he's pimping out his wife to Pharaoh, or to the king there to basically save his own life and save hers, and then there's all this plague that comes on him, and then of course he's sleeping with Hagar, with his handmaid, and when we recognize that a person that's that immoral in our minds is the forefather of our faith, it's really kind of overwhelming, isn't it?
Yeah. Oh, incredibly so. And I think it changes everything for us, because, we look throughout all of Scripture, and the reality is that every single person, even see David, a man after God's own heart. We looked
Right.
at all these people throughout Scripture, and what we see is these are people who have made very poor decisions and very big mistakes, we would say, in terms of sin. But yet God says, no, I will
Right.
claim them. It's not based upon what they have done. It's based upon what I have done.
Right. Yeah.
That's our faith.
And our faith is built on it. And in Genesis 15:6 it says, and he believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness.
Yeah.
And so that really actually becomes, the crux of the Abraham story. And I think that's what he's actually saying. You have to believe in and trust in the fact that Jesus Christ is Lord, and that God, raised him from the dead.
Yes.
Really, that belief, holding to that truth, if that righteousness is granted to you, then you are permanently and forever altered in your spiritual DNA and in your spiritual makeup, aren't you?
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's Romans. None is righteous, no, not one. But through him we are made righteous. And it's just incredible. We see it all throughout this passage. Verse 16 says, therefore this promise comes by faith, so that it may be by grace and may be guaranteed to all of Abraham's offspring. You go down and it says in verse 21 that being fully persuaded that God had power to do what he had promised. You back up to verse 13, and at the end of it says, but through the righteousness that comes by faith.
Yes.
It's everywhere in this passage.
And so it's his faith. It's not his morality, and that
Right.
is so hard for us. It is so hard for me because I want to find some kind of moral standard. I heard a person say this past week. I was listening, and I think there was just a misspeak, but the person said that you become a Christian by confessing Jesus as Lord by the way that you live. And I'm like, whoa, why did we just add by the way that you live?
Yeah.
How about just confessing that Jesus Christ is Lord?
Right.
I mean, you don't have to add by the way that you live. And I know that we want to. I know that we want to control people's behaviors. But I think that we're primarily concerned with other people's behavior. Because I always say that to someone when they say, oh, I want to do this or I want to do that. I say, is that what you're going to do? You're telling me I can trust Jesus and then I can, smoke dope all I want and, sleep around. I'm like, is that what you want to do? And they're always like, well, no, not me, but others.
Yeah.
Do you find that? And does that happen in the youth ministry? I know you're working with youth all the time. Do they have that
Yeah,
idea?
I mean, I think part of what this comes from is people are asking questions, and Paul is prepared to give an answer to people he knows are going to be asking questions. I think often in the faith, we're infinitely more concerned with where other people are at or what other people might do, and that's how we pose it. And we have to understand that, no, this gospel is, yes, it's for everyone, but it's for us, and it's not being concerned with the morality of others or being concerned with our own morality in terms of those types of questions. It's missing the point. It's missing the point of everything that's being taught here, and that our faith is rooted in. And like you said at the very beginning, it's an adding to of the gospel.
Right.
And so.
Yeah, and I think there's always a temptation to do that, and I think it might be good for you guys in your groups to spend some time talking about some of the ways that you have seen other people add to the gospel. Jesus plus, what did they put in the blank, and really maybe even confessing from your own experience, sometimes that you have put something in there that kind of, led to that direction. I don't know.
Yeah. No, I think that's really good, and I think that's a question we all need to ask ourselves. What is it that I have believed or wrestle with believing that is something that must be added to the gospel?
Right.
And why is it that? Why do I feel that I need to add that? Like you said, when that guy said, confess, and then through my works, it's
right.
why do we feel the need to add that? And maybe even add that in the conversation.
I think because we oftentimes turn to religion, and I use that word intentionally, religion to control behavior.
Yeah.
And Christ, ironically enough, controls our life. As a matter of fact, he basically removes our old life and brings in a new life. And I don't want to get into Romans chapter 5, quite yet, but basically there was one Adam that took us and put us all in death, and the new Adam comes and takes us out of death and puts us into his life, and his life becomes ours. And so really, it's not about change, it's about exchange.
Yes, I love that.
And there's a massive difference between the two. Maybe you can talk about that a little bit in your group. That might be helpful for you to kind of stop the video right now and to think about this. What's the difference between just trying to change your life and an exchange for His righteousness? I'm not trying to live out my own. I'm not doing the best that I can do. I'm actually living out what Jesus has already done. You find that hard for you?
Oh, man, so hard. But I love that word. I love that you use exchange, because it implies for us that it's a complete transition. Changing is maneuvering around. Exchanging is saying, I'm going to take mine and I give it to you, and you're going to give me yours completely.
Yeah, right.
And that's what God does with us. He exchanges.
So it's not like, we've got this. I saw a guy one time, he made this this model, and he had this red circle, and then he had this blue area, and he said this blue area represents Christ, and over time, spiritual maturity is where Christ takes up more and more of the circle. But in reality, what is supposed to happen is, with a new identity, is the blue and red are supposed to become purple. In other words, there's supposed to be a brand new creation that is Christ being lived out in my flesh. Mm-hmm. And that's really kind of complex, and maybe you can talk about that, or maybe you even have some questions. We'd certainly entertain those. And so, direct all those questions to T. Heidelberg at clifec.com. He's going to be the one to answer all of those questions that you might possibly have.
For sure. Yeah, send them my way.
So, anything else you have right here before we close out this particular session, week 6 of the book of Romans?
Man, I would just say, hey, as the people of God, let's believe that His word is true, and let's believe what His word says. And when it says that all we must do to be saved is believe that Jesus is Lord, that God sent His Son to die for us, let's rest in that truth.
Yeah. And this text says, the God who justifies the ungodly.
Yeah.
So it's not like the God who justifies those who have started acting godly.
Right.
Or those that have gone through the godly motions or the religious activities. But it's God who justifies, who makes right the ungodly. And so that's really what we're thanking God for.
That's exactly what we're thanking God for.
So thanks for joining us. We're glad that you've been a part of this discussion, and we hope that you have a great discussion amongst your group, and we look forward to talking with you next week as we continue on our 7th week of Romans and move into Romans chapter 5. Yes. God bless you.